Alrighty, it looks like it is 11 o'clock, so we will go ahead and kick things off. Hi everyone, welcome to Industry Insights Episode 6, What IA Wants in BIM Content. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We are very excited to have Nancy McClure, Digital Design Application Specialist at Interior Architects, join us as our special guest. During our discussion today, Nancy will provide her valuable insight on the key elements of high-quality BIM content and what she looks for in the vetting process, geometry and data standards, as well as what makes a good Revit family. Finally, we'll learn about Nancy's first-hand experience working with Unify's content creation services team as an extension to IA's design team. At the end of our 30-minute interview, we'll get to our live Q&A with questions from our audience. If you have any questions that come up throughout the interview, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your Zoom window to ask. We will get to as many of these questions as we can at the end of the interview. Without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to our host, Unify's very own BIM specialist, Jay Merlon, to get the interview started. Jay, take it away.
All right, thanks, Laura. And to kick things off, I'd like to give our listeners out there a little heads up and, keep in mind that you all come from different sides of the industry. And we realize that you're not only on the architectural design side. We also have several listeners from, say, engineering and construction, and maybe even some BIM-savvy owners and manufacturers out there. So with all these facets of our industry listening in, we should all be aware that we all have different use cases for BIM content. And actually, the content itself can come in many different formats. Just to give you guys some examples, engineers might want to use usable data in BIM content for calculations, and contractors might have a critical need for accurate geometry for coordination. Owners might even be looking at BIM content to help streamline project management and facilities management. So with all of these different use cases for BIM, I'm sure there's one thing we really can all agree on, and there's really no shortage of standards and best practices out there. So for today, let's just keep an open mind to the specific needs of IA, and even though some of their requirements might not apply directly to you, at least one takeaway from this discussion is a better understanding of what just one leading international architectural firm wants in BIM content. And before we dive into the conversation with Nancy, I wanted to share a quote with you all, as I typically do. Respect the building blocks, master the fundamentals, and the potential is unlimited. And I know this is more of an inspirational quote to help motivate you in life, but I think it can be applied directly to what we do here in BIM. We're all tasked with virtually designing and constructing buildings, but what are those building blocks and what are those fundamentals? Because I think, again, we can all agree that a building information model is literally nothing without BIM content. So in other words, the objects that go into your models are the very building blocks and fundamentals of this new form of delivery in our industry. So now I'd like to go ahead and welcome Nancy McClure, who is the Design Intelligence Lead at Interior Architects. Nancy, it's great to have you on as a guest. I know you've been a listener on previous webinars and have asked some really great questions during our Q&A sessions. So it is great to give you a voice here as a guest. So welcome, Nancy.
Thanks a lot, Jay.
All right, let's go ahead and kick things off with just some, let's start at the top. Can you tell us more about IA and what you do at your firm?
Great, yes. Well, IA Interior Architects is an international architecture firm. We specialize in corporate interiors, and we have 21 offices spanning 3 countries with a number of global alliance partners. And as a digital design application specialist, I come from a traditional architectural background, so I have over a decade of experience in project design and documentation. And as a member of our corporate level design intelligence team, I bring that experience to reviewing and customizing our workflow processes, looking at our various design tools and increasing efficiency of our teams at all stages, from the design through document production and construction coordination. And that involves vetting new tools, adapting them into our current processes, providing documentation, and effectively implementing those processes across the firm.
Wow, fantastic. We'll definitely get into some more detail here as we progress through the interview. But maybe we can also chat a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced at a firm such as IA, associated with BIM and maybe even specifically with content, some of those challenges.
Oh, certainly. Well, so IA has adopted a BIM approach, I would say probably in the last 6 or 7 years, and the evolution of working directly with BIM models, with BIM three-dimensional pieces has been definitely an evolution. The major change to our designers' workflows is that it becomes the primary tool throughout the life cycle of the project. So this single design model is doing much more work. It's starting off at the early design stages of conceptual design, where we're doing program validation and things that might be very heavy data analysis, and then we evolve it through the complex designs into much more advanced visualization and full documentation, and then taking it through construction coordination and even further on into facility management, or extracting information out for facility management. So the opportunity for the BIM to effectively transfer information through each phase is tremendous, but it does have a lot of challenges with that. It means that the content of the model needs to be flexible enough at the early stages to be adapting to many different design concepts, but it also needs to be able to evolve into being more accurate and information rich enough to support the documentation stages. So taking this single BIM through all of those phases is a balancing game of simplicity to complexity, and when does that complexity need to be introduced. And then ourselves as a design firm, as an interiors firm, we're seeing the need to introduce that complexity, both visually and in the associated information, just earlier and earlier in the process.
Right, that's fantastic. And you mentioned something there that struck a chord with me, and that's related to facilities management. It seems like you've been in the industry for quite a bit, and I'm curious about, have you seen, maybe lately, or maybe, within the last few years, have you seen a bigger push for the owners to try to consume some of that information from these models?
Definitely in terms of information. We haven't quite seen many opportunities to do any direct reuse of the model into that mode, but definitely harvesting the information and getting that information out to the different modes that are out there is key. And it does take a fair amount of modification to what is coming from the model to achieve that. It's definitely a challenge.
So there's I hear you there. I mean, there's a number of different standards out there, such as Kobe and other things like that. So it is, I'd say, a relatively new process for our industry. So it's exciting to see us moving in that direction. Hopefully, moving owners, further and further away from the paper binders and more into databases that they can use for their benefit. Okay, well, thank you for that, Nancy. Now I'd really like to touch on some of the standards and best practices that you guys have at IA. So just starting, I know you guys are heavily using Revit. So what are some of those needs and requirements for Revit families, even from like a visualization perspective or from a data perspective?
Yeah, both of those. So as an architecture firm that focuses on interiors, obviously we have a very strong demand for depicting accurate geometry and embedded materiality. So visualization is really, really high for us. But we also have a number of constituent groups within our firm. We have workplace strategies, who focuses a tremendous amount on embedded data, both from singular projects, but also extracting and aggregating that data. We have an experiential design graphics team who pushes our visualization to pretty wild places, not just on individual content, but for entire spaces. And we have a specialty lighting design services group, all of which have very specific performance needs, so that they can run analysis on our projects to do the various calculations and task lighting, foot candle analysis, and daylight balancing, and things that team's specific goals are as well. So when we talk about our content, we're looking both at it from, are we getting the data that's necessary to support that early analysis, program validation? Are we achieving the visuals that our design teams are expecting very early on to be accurate to the pieces that they're specifying, and the amount of change that those designs can evolve through? And then also supporting those very specific analysis needs. So we're asking a lot of our content to do that. So even as an interiors focusing on graphics and visualization, we are very information and analysis oriented as well with our content.
Right, and that does make sense, because really, as I mentioned earlier, I do feel that content is really everything, from the source of the data and obviously the geometry and visualization aspect. So earlier you had mentioned, you have an in-house graphics team that is sort of pushing your, your visualization to the next level, maybe. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, what sorts of technologies are you guys into and dabbling with, or even, providing to your clients?
We go all across the gamut. So our pieces are moving from, what might be a generic piece that's being laid out for quantities and spatial layout and whatnot. Those generic pieces need to evolve into specific furnishings very quickly, actually. And our design studios are looking at a broad number of different tools. So we're doing realistic rendering very early on. We're using virtual reality on virtually every project. So, and that's both in our internal design review processes, also as in with client representations and client presentations. So we need that geometry to be accurate to the specifications of the manufacturer content. We also need that geometry to be lightweight enough so that we can transport that very quickly into virtual reality at various stages, and keeping it lightweight in terms of triangles, if you can excuse that jargon, is very important to us. And then the level of detail for those pieces also needs to evolve through to support our documentation.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, we had a webinar not too long ago regarding virtual reality. So I am curious about this technology because it seems like it's progressing at rather a fast pace. And I think BIM is part of an enabler that lets us do sort of that rapid iteration. We no longer have to model things manually and individually and try to keep up with client requirements. But I'm curious about when you mentioned VR for presentations for your clients, have you guys experienced the request of having these kind of user group sessions with the clients where folks that will necessarily be actually occupying your space after it's been built, putting on those VR goggles and kind of exploring? I'm curious about that. Has that made its rounds around to you guys?
Definitely. And so when we are looking at using VR early in the design process, it's specifically for those types of collaborations. We have the client's team that might actually represent their real estate side or their own design teams, but they have specific user groups as well that can be invited into these groups so that they can discuss with us how the actual flow is for the job that they do. And that can be very, very insightful in terms of specific teams bringing their requirements and, how do we need to bring information or take steps from one area of the plan into another area, and what conflicts are we going to run into in terms of privacy, and things like certain groups that we have, they're very very strong restrictions on which groups can have access into what other groups' exposure is, whether it's for legal reasons or for just control reasons. So having those specific user groups be able to put on a headset and go through the flow of their day into a project when you're still early in the design stage can be quite critical in making sure that you're getting those alignments and things appropriate to that user. Absolutely,
yeah. That's very exciting stuff in our industry. So getting back to the standards, best practices of BIM content, you mentioned a little bit about data. I'm curious as to data standards, maybe at a project level, or maybe even requirements like what we discussed earlier about owners being able to consume the data. I'm curious about how you guys are. Maybe are there standards that you guys are currently adhering to, maybe at project handover or internally, or how do you approach the data standards internally? Yes,
so we use our content gets down to specific make and model for a lot of our pieces, because we are actually specifying furnishings and things as part of our final deliverables. But we also rely on a number of shared parameters that are customized by us to process a lot of data and to make data that would not necessarily be output that needs to go to a client, but it's part of our internal teams putting information in and supporting some of our analysis flows. So we rely on shared parameters quite a bit. And as we're getting content from different sources, in some cases that means we need to supplement that content. So we do get content from manufacturers, but in many cases we need to amend that content to get our shared parameters into it. Sometimes it goes directly into the family because that information is actually going to port with that piece from project to project, but in many cases it's data that's applied in the project environment. It's specific for that project's use. So our standards are looking at what comes with the particular category, making sure that pieces are in the right category, making sure that they're getting the appropriate shared parameters that are necessary for our workflows, and combining all of that information. So the shared parameters are critical for us in terms of getting that information from those pieces to schedule properly in our documentation, so that pieces coming from various sources do have the consistency that we need, and supporting all of our external processes.
Great. And what about, you know, your firm maybe at a corporate or executive level in terms of data? Because, you know, this term big data is all over, you know, all industries, I would say, globally. I'm curious as to if IA is sort of leveraging the data amongst all of your projects, if there's any opportunity there for an international multi-office firm such as yourself to kind of zoom out and see all of that data.
Oh, sure. Yeah, much of our work is with repeat clients, and we work with major corporate entities that have varying degrees of standardization across their campus projects. And the coordination of our teams can get very region appropriate and up-to-date content that's necessary to be added in. So we do have contractual obligations to track a lot of that evolution of content. And using a service like Unify has really been essential for us to keep that organization there. So we can talk about data that's embedded in the families and embedded in the project, but we're also looking at just managerial data of these pieces. How many content pieces are available for a specific client or for a specific genre of work, and are they being used appropriately in those projects? And being able to see that data across how all our content is used is very important for us maintaining those standards. And probably as important to our contractual obligations, it's a demonstrable tracking method that can increase the confidence that our content is being used appropriately.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, and what about, you know, just in general, maybe you close out this topic of best practices and standards. Do you have any advice for our listeners out there, just maybe a general statement on what really makes for a good piece of BIM content or Revit family?
Well, we'll be speaking in terms of our needs, of course, which heavily rely on visualization, but accurate, spatially accurate geometry is important to us. We actually really want that content to be native Revit geometry, both for the impact of material assignment and control of materials, but also how those pieces behave when they've been put into, say, the VR environment. Proper template selection is really important for us in terms of consistent hosting and origin points, because as a design team that's evolving different iterations of a design, we need to be able to change those pieces out cleanly. You'd be surprised at how many pieces don't swap cleanly, or things that can really change the alignment of a space when you think you're just switching one piece of furniture for another piece of furniture, for instance. So standards can come all the way down to, does it insert at the same point to make that type of process work? So coordinated parameter data for our scheduling and for our project documentation is important, and just allowing project level customization, because we do a very high amount of customization for products, even things that we're getting directly from manufacturers. So all of that, in addition to, you know, the standard things that we've discussed in the industry for a long time. Does this piece of content have clean, streamlined graphics, right, for our documentation purposes? We still, you know, print documentation sets and send them out for permit, so all of that's still a necessary part as well. But again, we have a much heavier emphasis on accurate visualization and material representation because of our focus on interiors.
Well, that's fantastic. Yeah, so as you spoke about, you know, moving from an early phase of a project and moving all the way through into the construction administration phase, and even, I'm sure, you know, during post-occupancy or handover, being able to swap those families out, it seems like a critical piece of that, right? Because at those early stages, I'm sure that you've got, you know, like you said, some placeholder families, you know, maybe they're not necessarily spec'd out with a specific model or manufacturer, but you need to make sure that when you swap it out, the chairs and the furniture doesn't go out of whack and you need to go in and manually realign everything.
Yes, yeah.
Just as one example, right? Do you guys see a need for, let's say, LOD specific content? Like, maybe your SD phases, you'll have LOD 100 or 200, and then you'll move all the way up until 500. Is that part of your strategy, or is that something that you guys have considered?
Quite honestly, we don't rely as much on that approach of 100 to 500 LOD level. We do need for the content to be clear and visible in our documentation. But again, because we put an emphasis on realistic visualization very early on in the design process, it benefits us when the geometry is to that higher level of geometric accuracy, because we're doing visualization at very early stages. So for us in our industry, in our interiors focus, we don't really stress so much the 100, 200, 300 levels.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And then also, we were talking about VR and really in terms of a good family or a good piece of content. I did hear a guy over at IA mention things like, triangle counts or number of facets or faces on an object. It seems like that would also be a critical piece of you guys building VR environments.
Yes, definitely, and we work with our development partners in VR to be able to review content very early on, so that we can get and identify which pieces might be triangle heavy and resolve some of those pieces. The impact of a piece that might have a very heavy impact on VR is it just restricts the amount of area of a project that we can show within that scenario. So we don't want to have to cut a model up and only have a VR experience for a small portion of it, because the content within that is so heavy that it's exceeding our triangle limits. So we really look to make sure that the content excuse me, that the content is streamlined enough to just make sure that those environments are moving smoothly. And the triangle count that we've seen is pretty much based on the original format that content is built in. So you do see sometimes foreign geometry that's been put in a Revit wrapper, I'll say, and that content tends to be very mesh oriented and very heavy with triangles, and then so we can end up having a few pieces, a few families that are built that way that can basically break the VR. So what we really do is we vet those pieces pretty regularly. We look at rebuilding some of that content if it's built in a way that doesn't support our VR purposes, and work with partners such as Unify to make sure that we're getting the most streamlined content that we can.
Fantastic. And yes, on that note, that's a good segue here. So IA is one of our best content creation customers, and actually I've had some direct feedback from one of our leads there, Kevin Hunt. He said you're probably one of the most favorite people he's ever worked with. So yes, he was really excited to hear that we had you on a webinar here. But so on that note, so we do offer content creation services, and we actually sent out some Twitter polls relating to this topic, because we do realize that it's not always in the best interest of a design or a construction firm to send out that content to be created by a third party. And actually, if I could just share some stats on that, we asked, what are your thoughts on third parties building BIM content for your firm? And actually 67%, actually said that it doesn't work for them. And then also, who builds BIM content at your firm? And only 13% replied that there was a third party that was building the BIM content for them. So I am curious, how did your team at IA identify that need for an external BIM content creation team?
Oh, sure. Well, because we are focusing on interiors, our design teams are constantly seeking out the latest available products across furniture and fixtures. They come back from, design conferences, and immediately they want to be looking at this new catalog and new inventory of content, very few of which is available directly as Revit families from those manufacturers. We did look at building a lot of that content in-house, and we do have a very strong bench of modelers within our ranks, but that can be a very time-consuming process, and that would interrupt our project teams from doing the rapid iteration design that they do. So seeking out an external team to design it was benefiting us in many ways. Is we wanted to be able to control the standards, and so we work with Unify by making our own custom family templates. So we've been able to provide those by having one third-party developer for a lot of our content. We can provide those customized templates so that we know that the content that's being built is going to work with our documentation standards. We have regular meetings with them to talk about what our goals are in terms of the native Revit geometry going in there, smart ways of developing that content, and just making sure that it's going to work. So that, we have a lot of strong communication with that team to make sure that those things are happening as well. We do sometimes still use content directly from manufacturers when it's available, but we do still see that often needs some modification, either to streamline it or to make sure that the parameters that we need are available in it. So it's sort of a mix of both things. We're getting content directly from manufacturers. There's a small amount of in-house modeling that we still do, mostly for systems tools or things that are going to be working with, say, our Dynamo processes or something along those lines, and then relying on Unify, our third-party contributor, to create content for us. Adhering strictly to our guidelines has been a really good way of extending our team's capabilities in terms of customizing, but making sure that our teams are focusing on the things that we need them to do. We want our design teams to design and spend their time doing that, and the support of the third-party content producers is really part of that.
Right, and I think you actually raised a great point there, because I have heard, frequently that certain folks maybe are kind of shying away from having third parties develop the content because they think maybe it's sort of this like throw it over the fence type of workflow. But it sounds like, you do meet with our content team frequently and identify needs and requirements. So that's good to know, because we typically like to consider ourselves an extension of your team, not necessarily, you're not necessarily outsourcing. So that's great to hear that validation from your point of view.
That's true, and I could see how with some disciplines, having a third party create these pieces might pose some issues with terms of like systems all connecting. But for us, probably our highest performance families are going to be lighting fixtures, and so we, as long as those templates and things that we're providing to that party are working with the processes and our analysis tools, that works very well for us. And then furniture is often fairly standalone, so we can get a lot of efficiency out of a third party developer.
Fantastic. We did touch a little bit on some of the advantages of working with us, Unify, to build the content, obviously improving the allocation of some of those resources so that your designers or your modelers can stay on projects, project-specific tasks other than just building furniture products and things of that nature. But do you have any other insight to some of the advantage of working with Unify to build your content?
Well, we find many advantages. So we definitely are utilizing the fact that Unify has a development team that can ebb and flow based on what our demand flow is. There are times when we have a lot of content that needs to be created, and Unify has the capacity to address that and get those content pieces back to us in a timely manner, which is very important to us. And Unify performs quality assurance tests. So again, part of that constant check-in, or that regular check-in with the team, is to make sure that that they know what to be looking for that meets our requirements. So they do a good amount of quality assurance on their end. And then they're also able to deliver the content directly to the users who requested it via our use of the Unify web hosting libraries. And that cuts a huge amount of time out of the process of getting content into the right hands and making sure that those designs can proceed at the pace that our projects do, which is a very, very high pace.
Right, definitely understand that. And so, you mentioned stuff about like turnaround time. What is the process like that that supports the life cycle of a piece of content? I know that we have our own built-in content request forms in our Unify application. So maybe you can just quickly walk us through, from start to finish, what is it like to request a piece of content to be built by us?
Sure. So we do use Unify, the web hosting content management system. So the request process that's built into that interface, we actually find that we supplement that. So we have an internal request form that a team fills out that specifies what library they want that piece to go to, if there are any specific needs in terms of how the materiality is going to be applied to that project, certain desires that they might have of whether or not that content is going to be used for full-on rendering. In some cases, we have very complex pieces that don't need to be going through that process. They may be more back-of-house pieces, and so we can identify that and get faster turnaround for those. So the request process that's built into Unify is supplemented with some additional instructions from our team. That goes up to the development team. We have a trackable process. We can see what requests have gone into the system. We can see when, if they're pending, if they're in process, if they've been delivered out to a specific library. And then those notifications go out to those users as well. And some notifications come directly to our management team as well, so we can keep tabs on all of that. And through Unify's dashboards, we're also able to see very globally how much content is being generated, where, what libraries is it going into, how is that content being consumed out of each library. So altogether, that whole tracking system is really beneficial for us to see who's requesting, see how quickly it's going out to them, giving them direct access to it once it's available, and us seeing that whole flow.
Well, that's great to understand that you guys are actually leveraging the data from a content request. So it seems like, you know, you guys are keeping track of these requests, and also maybe are you guys also sort of tracking it by office? Like, you know, this particular office requested X amount of pieces of content this quarter, and I'm curious, as you know, if you're actually using that information to like maybe calculate your ROI on using an external team as well.
Yeah, definitely. For our cases, it's more client-specific work. So we have teams that work very specifically with our extended client teams. And so we can now see which client team is requesting content at periods of time. And by using the Unify interface, we can also see iterations of that content. And that's very important for us as well, because our long-standing relationships with our clients do evolve content over time. And when we have a number of projects going on with them, it may only be that the most recent projects are going to get some of those updates, whereas other projects that are deeper in the documentation or heading into construction would not be receiving that most latest update. So we do have to track which version is appropriate for which project, and using the interface of Unify is really enabled us to do so.
That's fantastic. That's great. It's great to hear your feedback on, you know, the process and even, you know, using our application as, you know, sort of that platform for us to be able to collaborate with folks like you guys. So, you know, just to wrap things up here in the interview piece, just curious if you have any final closing thoughts here for our listeners out there before we jump into the Q&A session.
Well, just in summary, as an international firm, having cloud-hosted content has been a huge efficiency method for us to make sure that we're distributing that content with the most efficient way. And the interface is allowing us to track and see what the iterations and changes of that content are, and being able to see which projects it's been inserted into, and knowing that that's appropriate has been just very important for us in terms of maintaining the appropriate standards across our projects.
Right, and that's a great point as well with our Unify Core application. Is, you know, I do like to promote that it actually provides some historical reference as well. So you've got the request. You know, I call it the entire life cycle of a piece of content, because once that request is been fulfilled, that same piece of content that gets attached to that request actually becomes that piece of content that lives in your library. So there isn't this sort of disconnect between what's submitted to the client and what lives in your library. It can essentially be that same exact object. And then also, as you mentioned, that historical reference of all of the revision history and even notes tied to those revisions, I do think that that's a critical piece of developing content for BIM. So great, thank you for that, Nancy. So with all that being said, it was a pleasure speaking with you, Nancy, as always. And I'll go ahead and hand the floor back over to Laura to handle the Q&A session.
Great, thanks, Jay.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Jay, for that very informative discussion. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the Zoom window to submit your questions for Nancy and Jay. It looks like we've already had some come through, and then we already had some from form submissions before the webinar, so we'll go ahead and get to as many as we can in the next few minutes here. The first question is, I have a question about turnaround time. or the user, better yet, has a question about turnaround time. How long on average does it take you to request a piece of BIM contact back from Unify?
Well, that can depend on the complexity of the piece. Generally, we like to have about a 3 to 5 day turnaround on pieces. If there's a high volume for that, then we tell our teams to space out their requests so that they're requesting, you know, say 3 to 5 pieces at a time, and that way we can have them prioritize which ones, you know, they can look at the complexity of a piece and know that something might take a bit longer and schedule that out. But we generally see a turnaround time of about 3 to 5 days.
Okay, awesome, thank you. The next question is, how did you discover Unify? Did you investigate any competitors? If so, how did they compare and why did you decide to go with Unify?
We did look at a number of competing systems, and for us, a main critical factor was that it be cloud hosted, because that took a lot of the weight off of our own internal IT teams, and because we are so distributed across different countries, having cloud hosted a service is really key for us, making sure that the content that we put up there is immediately available to someone in a faraway distance. So the cloud hosting was very important. We looked at, don't necessarily want to name other systems that we evaluated, but the usability of the interface was very important for us. We can customize the libraries and set permission levels and specific users who have access directly into libraries, and all of that level of control allowed us to extend what our relatively small DI team has to manage, and giving the proper controls to the proper people to manage the content for their specific uses. We have close relationships with all of those, what we call librarians, who manage that content, but it's the interface of Unify that really allows that to happen.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Nancy. The next question we have here, what is the average size of a furniture family in MB for your use? Something that has been optimized for renderings in VR, but also your data analytics.
I'm not sure I would be able to cite something right off the top of my head. Again, because we have such a broad range of content that can go from a simple end table all the way up to a very complicated multi-station bar service type of a piece, the range is pretty significant. What we do look for is triangle counts for specific pieces. And again, I'm not sure I could actually be able to throw a number out there, but we look at it across a range. So we can look at a number of family contents within a certain project, and what we're looking for are the anomalies that stick out in terms of size and triangles. So not so much that we're focusing on a specific number, but we're looking at comparable pieces and looking for pieces that are anomalies to that size bracket.
I have a quick follow-up question there on that note. For triangle counts, I'm curious, how do you guys track triangle counts for a piece of content? Do you have a script that you run, or?
Well, with our development partner that's we're working with for VR, we have an add-on tool directly in Revit. So we can open up a family and run an analysis on it through that add-in tool.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you for that.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question, do you ever need to share content with partners or owners?
Not so much with owners at this stage. We definitely share content with our global partners. Through Unify, we can give restricted access to users external to our team to specific libraries. So in those cases where that's necessary, we do provide that. At this point, it's not in our contracts to deliver models to clients, although we are certainly providing them with takeaways such as VR experiences and things along those lines. But right now, at this point, we're not handing over models.
Okay, gotcha. And then on that note, that's a nice segue into our next question. It's regarding virtual reality. So tell us more about how you're using virtual reality to deliver to your clients. What tools are you using to do this, and what % of clients are asking for VR in delivery?
That's a good range of questions. So we do use VR. Our development partner with VR is Insight VR, and we've worked with them from very early stages. A lot of tools that we have with them have been developed directly through requests that our teams have in terms of experience and how to work with that interface. We use VR extensively for internal design reviews. We have some of our design directors, every single project that they work on, regardless of the size of it, is going into a VR internal review experience. What we provided with our clients can be a repeat experience. So in some scenarios, we have a VR setup that might be either on site or in their offices, so that they're having a sequential experience. Like, we can host a meeting and then they have a headset on in their own space and they can experience things that way. We have also set up URLs. So we work with 360 embedded renderings that can be produced from Autodesk and embed those into our VR experience. And that can either be recorded, and that can be a takeaway experience for the client, or we've even set up URLs so that with some of our clients, they want to take some of that VR, whether it's a 360 or a video walkthrough, and have that be part of their marketing approach. So we've had clients who've requested to have that as basically a deliverable to them that they can then have on their site and allow potential clients to their space to walk in and experience it in their own environment there.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next question. I know I need Unify, but don't have time to get it implemented at my firm. How long did it take you to trial and implement Unify at IA?
The trial period. So again, we did trials for several different services, and I believe we probably had about a 2-month period of time in which we reviewed those. And as an international firm, we have a lot of stringent IT requirements. So when you talk about implementation, it often has to have a conversation with your IT department and what are they going to require in terms of installing and testing and dealing with rollout. So we work really closely with our IT team, so we were able to get those reviews and testing and rollout happening within a relatively short period of time. So I think for us, it was maybe a 2 or 3 month window from evaluation to implementation.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Our next question. This is slightly off topic here, but nonetheless interesting. Nancy, what is your take on government mandated BIM standards?
We really haven't crossed that line yet. So with interiors, we haven't really gotten into that very much. We do some hospital work, but again, because we're focusing on interiors, we have not seen a push towards COBie or towards many of those standards.
Okay, gotcha. Well, thank you. And question here. Is there a cost associated with having custom-built Revit content created and provided by Unify?
Certainly there are costs involved. It is a service. They are providing a service for us. The way that we evaluate it, though, is based on what our billable time is and the time that it would and the cost it would be for us to have our own internal teams basically shift their focus away from doing production work on their specific projects and shifting over to doing what we would then consider essentially overhead work. So the costs for us tend to balance out, and in terms of having a team that can adjust to what our request demands are, the ebb and flow of those demands, and adjust with that has been key. So definitely costs, but we see it as being very efficient in balancing out with what those costs would be for us to do it in-house.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for answering all of those questions today, and thank you so much to our audience for engaging with us and asking those great questions. As I mentioned in the chat, we will be sending out a recording to this webinar later on to all of you who joined us, and we will also include a link to Unify's Create BIM Content Services. I wanted to thank you so much again, Nancy, for taking the time to join us today, and thank you to our audience members for attending. We look forward to having you at our next webinar, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Nancy.